My name is Monica Hayes. I am 31 years old, and nothing in my life had prepared me for the phone call that shattered my morning and redefined what family meant to me. It was an ordinary Wednesday, the kind of day where routine lulled me into thinking I was safe. I had just set my coffee on the edge of my desk, opened my laptop, and glanced at my calendar filled with back-to-back meetings when my cell phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered, expecting perhaps a client or an automated message, but the voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, and every syllable seemed to strike like a hammer. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. This is Andrew calling from Federal Trust Bank. I need to confirm the details of the $500,000 mortgage you recently took out in your name." For a second, I thought I had misheard. Mortgage. My breath caught, my hand jerked, and hot coffee spilled across my keyboard, dripping between the keys as though punctuating my disbelief. I asked him to repeat himself, my voice shaking. He did word for word, and the more he spoke, the more my stomach twisted into knots. According to his records, there was a loan $500,000 signed by me, secured by documents I had never seen. My name, my address, my social security number, all there, all violated. I felt like the ground beneath me was tilting. My pulse thundered in my ears. I told him there had to be a mistake, that I had never signed anything. There was a silence, the kind of silence that carries weight, and then he said quietly, "Miss Hayes, the loan papers were signed, notarized, and approved 2 weeks ago. Payments are already due." That silence split me open. I stood frozen, gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Then came the dagger. He told me that when the bank called the listed home phone to verify a woman had answered, confirming she was my mother, and assured them it was all correct. My mother. My heart slammed against my ribs. He continued almost apologetically that the paperwork indicated the loan was intended to support my brother's business debts. My brother. Brian. The words blurred together, forming a nightmare I could not wake from. I whispered that I needed copies, that I wanted every document sent to me immediately. He promised to email the PDF within the hour, and before hanging up, he said almost gently, "I know this must be shocking, but your family insisted this was your responsibility. Pay for your brother. It's your duty." I froze. The phrase seared into me like a brand. Pay for your brother. It's your duty. As if my existence, my career, my independence were nothing more than a safety net for Brian's endless failures. I hung up, staring at my shaking hands, the coffee spreading across the desk like a stain I could never scrub clean. My mind flashed back through years of sacrifices, the quiet humiliations of being told to be the bigger person, to let Brian take shortcuts to carry the family's burdens while he drifted free of consequence. It all funneled into this single moment, a $500,000 betrayal carved into legal documents, with my name forged across the bottom. My throat closed, tears stung my eyes, but then something unexpected happened. I felt a laugh building in my chest, a bitter, sharp laugh that tasted like iron. I pressed the phone to my lips, breathing hard, and for the first time in my life, I smiled. It was not a smile of acceptance, not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of someone who had finally been pushed past the edge, the smile of a woman staring into the abyss and deciding to fight back. The bank representative could not see it, but that smile meant everything. They had taken my name, my trust, my identity. They thought they had broken me, but what they did not know was that this betrayal had lit a fire that would burn through every lie, every toxic demand, every ounce of control my family thought they had over me. I smiled, but my silence carried a promise. The law was stronger than blood, and soon they would learn that my duty was not to them, but to myself. I was born into the Hayes family, and for as long as I can remember, the hierarchy in our house had been carved in stone. My father, Richard Hayes, 64 years old, was a man who believed that his word was law, that his opinion was fact, and that his son was the crown jewel of our lineage. My mother, Patricia, 60, played the role of peacekeeper, though her peace was never about fairness, but about silencing me, smoothing things over, and maintaining the illusion of harmony. And then there was Brian, my younger brother, 28. The golden boy whose flaws were invisible, whose mistakes were covered like sacred artifacts, whose every stumble was blamed on circumstance rather than character. From the earliest days, the message had been clear. Brian was the one to protect, and I was the one to endure. I was the eldest, the strong one, the daughter. That last word always carried a weight in my father's tone, as though it were a limitation stamped on my birth certificate. He had grown up in a household that believed sons carried the family forward and daughters were simply expected to support. He carried that poison into our home, and my mother, though softer in her words, reinforced it with every plea to me to let things go, to be kind, to put family first. Family first always meant Brian first. I remember being 12 years old, bringing home straight A's on my report card, clutching it with pride, waiting for a smile or praise. My father glanced at it, nodded briefly, and then turned to Brian, who had scraped by with barely passing grades. Richard's eyes softened as he said, "Don't worry, son, grades don't measure real talent. You'll find your way." I stood there, my achievement dissolving into dust, and realized that in this house my excellence would always be invisible. Years later, when I was accepted into a top university, I had to take out my own loans and work part-time jobs to afford it. Brian, on the other hand, failed out of his first college, and instead of criticism, he was rewarded with a brand new car to lift his spirits. When he racked up credit card debt, my mother quietly asked me to help pay it off. When he got arrested for a bar fight, my father hired an expensive lawyer and told me firmly, "This stays in the family." I swallowed every injustice, every time my worth was measured not by who I was, but by how much I could sacrifice. I paid hospital bills when my mother had surgery. I covered rent when Brian claimed he could not find a job. I even signed over part of my savings when my father insisted the family business needed a temporary cash injection. Every time they looked at me not with gratitude, but with expectation, as though I were a resource, a living, breathing bank account, not their daughter. I told myself it was my role, that maybe one day they would see me, really see me as more than just the background character in Brian's story. But that day never came. Instead, the pattern deepened. When I started my career in accounting, working long nights, fighting through exhaustion to climb the ladder, my father scoffed. "A job is not the same as building something real," he said, dismissing my hard-earned salary as though it were pocket change. When Brian announced half-baked business ideas from a sports bar to a tech startup he barely understood, my father beamed, calling him an entrepreneur, a visionary. They funded him with whatever scraps they could gather, and when those ventures collapsed, they turned to me to patch the holes. Patricia would sit across from me at the kitchen table, wringing her hands, whispering, "He's your brother, Monica. He's fragile. You're strong. You can help." And I always did. Each time I bled pieces of myself into their chaos, hoping that the next sacrifice would finally be enough, that maybe love would return if I gave just a little more. But love never returned. Only demand. Only duty. I began to understand that in my family's eyes, my strength was not something to be celebrated, but something to be exploited. It was not respect. It was utility. And behind it all was the ugly truth of favoritism sharpened by gender. I was the daughter expected to give, expected to bend, expected to understand. Brian was the son expected only to exist and be excused. That double standard wrapped itself around every interaction, choking the air from my lungs until it became normal. But normal does not mean right. Normal does not mean tolerable. When I thought back to that phone call from the bank, when I heard the phrase, "pay for your brother," it was not just about money. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being told my existence was for someone else's survival. It was the echo of every time my father dismissed me, every time my mother begged me to stay quiet, every time Brian smirked as he walked away from responsibility that was silently loaded onto my shoulders. The $500,000 mortgage was not just theft. It was the final nail in a coffin they had been building for me since childhood. And as I sat there replaying their voices in my head, the weight of all those years pressing down on me, I realized something vital. They had underestimated me. They thought I was the obedient daughter, the dependable provider, the silent witness to their endless favoritism. They thought I would sigh, cry, and then write another check. But they had made one mistake. In giving Brian everything and teaching him that the world owed him, they had taught me something else. They had taught me resilience. They had taught me how to fight, and this time I would not fight for them. I would fight against them. The day after the phone call, I drove to my parents' house with a knot in my stomach and a folder in my bag already containing the initial PDF the bank had sent me. It was surreal to hold documents bearing my forged signature, a slanted version of my handwriting that screamed betrayal with every curve of ink. The drive out to the suburbs was one I had taken countless times before the tree-lined streets and familiar houses almost mocking me with their normalcy, as though the world had no idea that mine had been set on fire overnight. When I pulled into the driveway, Brian's car was parked carelessly at an angle, a sleek sports car he had no business affording. I stared at it for a long moment, the shine of the paint like a slap to my face, before gathering my courage and walking to the front door. My mother opened it, her face lighting up in surprise, then quickly dimming into caution. "Monica," she said softly, "what a surprise." I walked past her into the living room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step fueled by the fury I was barely containing. My father sat in his recliner newspaper folded neatly in his lap as though nothing in the world was amiss. Brian sprawled on the couch, eyes glued to his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I held up the folder like a weapon. "Do you have any idea what this is?" I demanded. My father sighed, already impatient. "Lower your voice, Monica. We don't need drama." "Drama?" I nearly laughed. A forged mortgage for $500,000 in my name is not drama. It's a crime. Brian looked up then, smirking in that infuriating way he had. "Oh, come on, sis. Don't be so uptight. You make good money. It's not the end of the world." "Not the end of the world," I snapped. "It's identity theft, Brian. It's fraud." My mother wrung her hands, stepping forward as though to placate me. "Sweetheart, it was just paperwork. You know your brother needed help. He's been under so much stress. He's fragile. You're strong." There it was again, that word, strong, a euphemism for sacrificial. A polite way of saying you will carry this because he cannot. My father finally spoke, his voice firm and cold. "It's family, Monica. We take care of each other. You're in the best position to handle this. It's your duty." I felt my chest tighten, anger and heartbreak colliding inside me. "My duty," I repeated, incredulous. "My duty is to protect myself, not to clean up after Brian's disasters." My father's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. "Watch your tone. You don't talk to me like that. And what tone should I use?" I shot back when my own parents conspired to destroy my financial future. My voice cracked, despite my effort to keep it steady. I wanted so desperately for one of them to break, to admit they were wrong, to apologize. I wanted to hear my father say he had gone too far, to hear my mother whisper that she regretted betraying me, to see Brian show even a flicker of remorse. Instead, what I received was silence. Cold, stubborn silence from my father, who refused to yield. Defensive, guilt-ridden silence from my mother, who stared at the floor. And smug, unapologetic silence from Brian, who leaned back against the couch as though this entire confrontation were a boring inconvenience. Finally, Brian spoke, his tone dripping with entitlement. "Look, Monica, this is just money. You're acting like we asked you to give up your life." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "Just money. $500,000 in debt tied to my name, my credit, my reputation. That's not just money, Brian. That's everything." He shrugged, unconcerned. "You'll figure it out. You always do. You're the responsible one." That single sentence broke something inside me. For years, I had been fed that line, the responsible one, the strong one, the one who could handle it. It had been used to justify every injustice, every theft of my time, my savings, my peace of mind. And now it was being used to justify a crime that could ruin my life. I turned to my parents, my voice shaking. "You could have told me. You could have asked. You could have trusted me enough to speak honestly. Instead, you lied. You betrayed me." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but not for me. "For Brian." "Please, Monica," she whispered. "He can't survive prison. He can't handle this pressure. You're his sister. You're supposed to protect him. And in that moment, the last flicker of hope inside me went out. There would be no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, no recognition of the years I had given them. Instead, there was only expectation. Expectation that I would continue to bleed for Brian, continue to sacrifice until there was nothing left of me. My father leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "If you walk away from this, Monica, you walk away from this family." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything. I met his gaze, my hands trembling, my heart breaking into pieces. "Maybe that's exactly what I need to do," I whispered. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his expression, but he masked it quickly with anger. "You're ungrateful," he snapped. "After everything we've done for you." "Done for me," I repeated, my laugh bitter. "You've never done anything for me that didn't come with a chain attached." I looked at Brian lounging as though untouchable, and my mother clutching her chest as though I had struck her, and I realized something painful and liberating all at once. They would never see me. They would never value me. They would never treat me as anything more than a means to an end. And for the first time, I stopped hoping. I stopped waiting for their love to balance the scale. I stopped believing that sacrifice could buy respect. Hope had died in that living room, smothered beneath the weight of their selfishness. All that remained was clarity. After that night, I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my chest heaving with a mix of rage and despair. The suburban houses blurred past streetlights flashing against my windshield, but all I could hear was my father's voice declaring that it was my duty and my brother's smug assurance that I would figure it out because I always did. By the time I reached my apartment, I was shaking, but underneath the shaking was something sharper, colder, and steadier than I had ever felt before. I knew what I had to do. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop to the email from the bank. Page after page of documents filled my screen, each one bearing my personal information, my forged signature, my stolen identity. I zoomed in on the slanted scrawl where someone had tried to mimic my handwriting and felt bile rise in my throat. It was crude, careless, but legally binding in the eyes of the bank until I proved otherwise. The notary stamp was real, which meant they had gone to extraordinary lengths to make this look legitimate. My hands shook as I printed the documents, stacking them into a neat pile, my mind racing through every possible angle. Who had signed them? Who had pretended to be me? How had they convinced a notary? And then, the next email came a scanned copy of the verification call logs with a note spoke with Patricia Hayes. Mother of applicant confirmed all details. My stomach dropped. I had hoped irrationally that maybe my parents had been ignorant that Brian had acted alone. But there it was, in black and white. My mother had participated, had lied, had conspired. Betrayal layered upon betrayal. I could not do this alone. I needed help, professional help, the kind that would not buckle under emotional manipulation or family pressure. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer recommended by a colleague. Her name was Karen Mitchell, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for being ruthless in court. When I walked into her office with my stack of papers, my throat tight and my hands trembling, she listened without interruption as I laid out the entire nightmare. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and said with quiet gravity, "Monica, this is identity theft and fraud. What your family has done is a felony. If you choose to pursue this, they could face prison time." The words sent a jolt through me, both terrifying and liberating. Prison. For my father. For my mother. For Brian. Could I really do that? Could I drag my own blood into the cold machinery of the law? Karen must have seen the turmoil on my face because she leaned forward, her tone firm. "Let me be clear. They forged your name. They stole $500,000 of your credit. They endangered your financial future, your career, your very livelihood. Family or not, this is a crime. You have every right to protect yourself, and if you don't act, this debt will bury you." I swallowed hard, nodding. She slid a legal pad across the desk. "I need you to make a list of every interaction, every detail, every piece of evidence you can recall. The more thorough, the stronger our case." That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by papers, scribbling notes until my eyes burned. I wrote about the car Brian should never have afforded. I wrote about the countless times my parents had asked me to cover his mistakes. I wrote about Patricia's voice on the verification log, calmly confirming details she knew were lies. I compiled emails receipts and even text messages where my mother had written, "He needs you again, please don't say no." When I handed it all to Karen the next day, she nodded approvingly. "This is good, very good." She opened a folder and began drafting the initial complaint to the bank and a police report. "The bank will freeze the mortgage while they investigate," she explained. "The police will begin looking into the forgery. And your family." She paused, her gaze steady. "They'll be served." My pulse quickened. Served. The image was almost surreal, imagining my father's face when someone knocked at his door with legal papers in hand. My mother's hands trembling not with disappointment in me, but with the consequences of her own actions. Brian's smirk dissolving into panic. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift, the weight of injustice sliding off my shoulders and onto theirs where it belonged. Over the following week, the investigation deepened. Karen accompanied me to the bank where we requested surveillance footage of the notary session. The grainy video showed Brian seated at the desk, my father standing beside him, my mother hovering nervously. The notary flipped through pages pointing where Brian scribbled something resembling my name. I gasped when I saw it, undeniable proof, the kind of evidence no amount of excuses could erase. Karen's eyes lit with satisfaction. "This is gold. With this, the case is airtight." The more I watched, the angrier I became. They had not even bothered to disguise it well. They had walked into a bank lied with straight faces and signed my future away as if it were nothing. That kind of arrogance, that kind of entitlement could not be ignored. Karen filed the police report, officially attaching the video, the forged documents, and my statement. The detective assigned to the case called me 2 days later, his voice brisk. "We're taking this very seriously, Miss Hayes. Forgery and identity theft are felonies. You've done the right thing by coming forward." Each confirmation strengthened my resolve. Each new piece of evidence hardened the part of me that had once wavered. There was no going back. My family had stolen my identity, but in doing so, they had forced me to claim something I had never fully owned my power. As I hung up the phone that evening, exhaustion washing over me, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes looked different, sharper, colder, stronger, and I realized something. For the first time, I was not the dutiful daughter waiting for scraps of approval. I was the woman who would no longer be their victim. I smiled again, but this smile was not bitter. It was a blade. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, not in the quiet privacy of a living room, but under the glaring lights of a family dinner meant to celebrate my aunt's birthday. Dozens of relatives gathered in the dining hall of my parents' house, crystal glasses clinking laughter, rising the illusion of unity hovering over the table like a fragile veil. I had not planned to expose them here, but when I saw Brian laughing loudly at the head of the table, boasting about his new investments as though he had not just committed fraud, something inside me snapped. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Karen had meticulously prepared copies of every document, every piece of evidence stacked neatly and damningly. The room fell silent as the papers hit the polished wood with a sharp slap. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks froze halfway to mouths. All eyes turned to me. My father's brows furrowed. "Monica." "What is this?" he asked, his tone a warning more than a question. I stood tall, my hands steady though my heart pounded. "This," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, "is a $500,000 mortgage you forged in my name." Gasps rippled around the table. My mother paled, clutching her pearls, while Brian rolled his eyes, trying to laugh it off. "Don't exaggerate, sis," he muttered. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal," I shot back, my voice rising. "You stole my identity! You committed a felony!" I turned to the table, my gaze sweeping over my cousins, aunts, uncles, all of them witnesses now. They forged my signature. They lied to a bank. They saddled me with $500,000 in debt. This isn't family. This is fraud. My father slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough. You will not embarrass us in front of everyone. Sit down." His command reverberated through the room, but I did not move. "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "You embarrassed yourselves the moment you decided to steal from me." My mother's voice trembled. "Monica, please, we can talk about this later. Don't do this now." I stared at her, my anger mingling with grief. "Later. You had weeks to come clean. You had every chance to admit what you did. Instead, you let me find out from a banker who thought I was complicit. You made me into a criminal in the eyes of the law, and you expect me to stay quiet to protect you." Brian leaned back in his chair, smirking as though this were entertainment. "You won't actually do anything, Monica. You're all talk. You don't have the guts to turn on your own family." His arrogance was gasoline poured onto the fire inside me. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my bag again and pulled out a thin envelope. I slid it across the table toward him. His smirk faltered as he picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside was the official copy of the police report stamped and signed. "I already did," I said simply. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My father's face turned red, veins bulging at his temples. "You would destroy this family," he hissed. "You would drag us through the mud, hand us over to strangers, all because of a little paperwork." "A little paperwork." I repeated, my laugh sharp and humorless. "This isn't paperwork. This is prison, identity theft, forgery, fraud." I locked eyes with him, unflinching. "You thought you owned me, that my life existed to bail Brian out. But you were wrong. The law doesn't care about your pride. The law cares about the truth." Around the table, relatives whispered shock written across their faces. One aunt shook her head in disbelief. Another cousin muttered, "How could they do that to her?" My mother's tears spilled over her shoulders, shaking, but I felt nothing. No pity, no guilt, no urge to comfort. She had chosen her side when she picked up that phone and lied to the bank. My father looked ready to explode, but Brian's composure cracked first. He shoved the papers back at me, his voice rising with panic. "You wouldn't let me go to jail," he barked. "You're my sister. You're supposed to protect me." I leaned forward, my eyes cold. "Protect you. For years I have sacrificed everything for you. My money, my time, my peace. And how did you repay me? By stealing my name, my future. You don't want protection, Brian. You want a slave, and I am done." I straightened, my voice ringing out across the stunned room. "I filed the report. The police are already investigating. The mortgage is frozen. And soon you'll all have to answer for what you did." A murmur swept through the table, disbelief and judgment colliding in hushed tones. My father tried to regain control, his voice booming. "If you go through with this, Monica, you're no daughter of mine." I looked at him, feeling the final tether between us snap. "Then I guess I'm finally free," I said. The words hung in the air like a verdict. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed was not mine to bear. It was theirs. The knock on the door came sooner than anyone expected. It was sharp, authoritative, and cut through the tense silence of the dining room like a blade. My mother flinched, her fork clattering against her plate. My father's face hardened, suspicion flickering across his features, while Brian shifted uneasily in his chair. I knew that sound and my pulse quickened. The door opened and two uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence heavy and undeniable. "Good evening," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "We are here to speak with Richard Patricia and Brian Hayes regarding an ongoing investigation." The room erupted in murmurs, relatives gasping, chairs scraping back. My father shot to his feet, his voice booming. "This is outrageous! You can't just barge into my home!" The officer held up a folder. "We have a warrant. The bank has submitted evidence of forgery and identity theft. We're here to gather statements and escort you to the station for questioning." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "there must be some mistake." But the officer shook his head. "The evidence is substantial." He turned his gaze toward Brian, whose earlier smirk had vanished entirely. His face was pale, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. "This isn't fair," Brian stammered. "It's family business. You can't treat it like a crime." The second officer's voice was cold. Family doesn't put someone's name on a fraudulent $500,000 loan. That's a felony, son. The weight of those words crashed over the room. Some relatives looked away in shame, others stared openly, their judgment written in their eyes. My father rounded on me, fury burning in his expression. "You did this," he growled. "You brought them here. You'd betray your own blood." I stood, my knees steady beneath me, and for once I didn't flinch under his glare. "No," I said, my voice sharp and unyielding. "You betrayed me. You stole from me. You made me a criminal in the eyes of the law. All I did was tell the truth." Behind me, the door opened again, and in walked Karen Mitchell, her dark suit immaculate, her eyes sharp as glass. She carried a folder under one arm and a confidence that filled the room. "Officers, thank you," she said briskly. "My client, Ms. Hayes, has provided extensive documentation. Forged signatures, notarized falsehoods, video surveillance, and phone records. This is not a misunderstanding. This is identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy." My father barked a laugh, trying to reclaim control. "Conspiracy against our own daughter? That's absurd." Karen's gaze cut to him like a scalpel. "Absurd is walking into a bank with your son signing your daughter's name without her consent and then lying to a notary. Absurd is a mother answering verification calls and confirming fraudulent details." She set the folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal still frames from the surveillance footage. The image was grainy but clear enough. Brian hunched over paperwork, my father standing beside him, my mother nervously watching. Gasps rippled again through the crowd of relatives. One of my uncles muttered, "That's them. That's clearly them." My father's face drained of color. Brian shot to his feet, knocking his chair over, his voice rising in panic. "You don't understand. I needed the money. I was desperate. Monica has always had everything she can afford it." The officer stepped closer, his voice firm. "Sit down, Brian, now." Brian's chest heaved, his bravado shattered, and slowly he sank back into his chair. My mother sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking while my father clenched his fists, his authority crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. Karen's voice rang out again, clear and unwavering. "The days of Monica being your scapegoat are over. The law does not bend to family favoritism. The law cares about facts, and the facts are not on your side." My father tried one last desperate angle, his voice low and venomous. "Monica, you don't have to do this. We can fix it quietly. Withdraw your complaint. Think of your family's reputation." I met his gaze, feeling the final strands of fear snap inside me. "Reputation?" I asked, my voice steady. "You destroyed our reputation the moment you forged my name. I will not be complicit. I will not be silent." The officer stepped forward with handcuffs, the metallic click sending a chill through the room. "Richard Hayes, Patricia Hayes, Brian Hayes, you are hereby taken in for questioning regarding charges of forgery, identity theft, and fraud." My mother cried out, pleading, "Monica, please stop them. You can stop this." But I stood motionless, my face cold, my heart resolute. I smiled, and this time the smile was not bitter or broken. It was a declaration. "You thought I was weak," I said softly, "but the law is stronger than blood." The officers led them toward the door, their protests growing weaker, drowned out by the murmurs of shocked relatives. The mighty patriarch reduced to a criminal suspect, the golden boy stripped of his entitlement, the doting mother revealed as a conspirator. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer the one carrying their sins. They were carrying their own. The weeks that followed were a blur of hearings paperwork and whispered conversations among extended family members who no longer knew which side to stand on. The case moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage forged documents, notarized lies, and the call logs with my mother's voice confirming every detail. All of it painted a picture so damning that even the most skeptical relative could not deny what had happened. Brian was charged with identity theft and forgery. Because it was his handwriting on the fraudulent signature and his face on the surveillance video, the case against him was strongest. His lawyer fought for leniency, painting him as a desperate young man manipulated by pressure, but the judge saw through the excuses. In the end, Brian received 18 months of probation with strict conditions. mandatory financial restitution, and a permanent mark on his record that would haunt him for years. He would never again secure a legitimate loan or hold a respectable job without this betrayal resurfacing. The golden boy had been unmasked, his entitlement exposed, his future tarnished. My father, Richard, did not escape unscathed. Though he did not physically sign the papers, his presence in the bank footage and his role in orchestrating the scheme made him complicit. The judge reprimanded him harshly, reminding him that age and authority were no shields against the law. Richard lost his seat on the community board, where he had been a respected member for decades. His colleagues distanced themselves, whispers spreading about the disgrace of a man once admired, now caught aiding fraud against his own daughter. Invitations dried up, his phone calls went unanswered, and the empire of pride he had built around himself crumbled into dust. He had always believed his word was law, but in the end, the only law that mattered was written in the court's verdict, not in his booming voice. My mother, Patricia, was perhaps the most pitiful. Her trembling voice on the verification call became the final proof of her complicity. Though she avoided prison time by claiming ignorance and blind loyalty, the shame that followed was punishment enough. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly now avoided her eyes. Friends at church whispered behind her back. She would never again host luncheons or boast about her family's achievements without someone remembering the scandal. But worse than the social exile was her emotional collapse. For years, she had shielded Brian, covering for him, defending him, excusing him. Now, watching her son branded a criminal and her husband disgraced, she fell into despair. Yet even in her sorrow, she could not bring herself to apologize to me. Instead, she clung to the belief that I had betrayed them. Her tears always for Brian, never for me. The house they had once guarded so jealously, the house they had tried to save by stealing from me, was seized by the bank. With the mortgage frozen and no means to pay it back, foreclosure was inevitable. I drove past it once after the eviction notice was posted, watching movers carry out furniture, the windows dark and lifeless. The sight did not bring me joy, but it brought me closure. The home where I had once believed family meant safety was gone, stripped away by their own greed. Some relatives cut ties with me, calling me cold, heartless, ungrateful. But many others, especially those who had watched silently for years, finally spoke up. At another family gathering months later, a cousin pulled me aside and whispered, "You did the right thing. We all knew how they treated you, but none of us had the courage to stand up. Now we see it clearly." Their words were bittersweet validation laced with regret that they had not defended me sooner. Still, it reminded me that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how long it is buried. Professionally, my life could have been derailed by the fraudulent mortgage, but because I acted quickly and decisively, my credit was restored. The bank issued formal apologies acknowledging their oversight and even offered me compensation for the stress and damage. My career, once at risk, now flourished as my colleagues saw not a victim, but a fighter. I had faced down my own family in a court of law and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. The Hayes name, once a banner my father carried with arrogance, now lay tarnished. But my name was intact, reclaimed, and stronger than ever. The consequences for them were severe as they should have been. Brian's reputation ruined Richard's pride, shattered Patricia's social circle dismantled, and the family home gone. They were forced to live with the reality that the daughter they had underestimated, dismissed, and exploited had become the very force that dismantled their illusions. And me. For the first time in my life, I did not carry their burden. They carried their own, and they would carry it for the rest of their days. When the dust settled, I found myself standing in the quiet of my new apartment, a modest but sunlit place on the 12th floor overlooking the city skyline. It was nothing like the sprawling house I had grown up in with its manicured lawn and suffocating walls of expectation, but it was mine. Every square foot was a testament to my freedom, every corner untouched by lies. On the first evening after I moved in, I unpacked a single frame and hung it on the wall above my desk. Inside was not a photograph, but a copy of the court order bearing my name, the official stamp, the document that had frozen the fraudulent mortgage and exposed the conspiracy. Some people might have hidden such a reminder, but for me, it was a victory banner. I wanted to see it every day to remind myself that I had chosen truth over silence, self-respect over duty, justice over blood. Life did not transform overnight. There were still moments when grief washed over me when I remembered my mother's tears or my father's rage when I thought of Brian's panicked face as the officers read him his rights. But grief is not the same as regret. I did not regret standing up. I did not regret breaking free. For years, I had been told that family meant sacrifice, that to be strong was to give endlessly without thanks, without recognition. But I had learned the truth. Family without respect is nothing but a chain heavy and unyielding, dragging you down until you forget who you are. I had broken mine. My career flourished, my colleagues seeing in me not only competence, but courage. I took on new clients, new projects, and with each success, I felt the weight of my family's betrayal fade further into the past. Friends who once pitied my devotion to my family now looked at me with admiration, telling me they wished they had my strength. I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor, someone who had clawed her way out of the wreckage and found solid ground at last. There were nights when the silence of my apartment felt strange, when I caught myself reaching for the phone to call my mother, or wondering if my father would ever speak my name without venom. But then I would look at the framed court order and remember. Silence was better than chains. Freedom was better than false love. Justice was better than peace built on lies. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life on my own terms. I traveled for the first time in years, standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon and breathing in the vastness of a world that had once felt so small. I enrolled in a painting class, rediscovering a joy I had abandoned long ago under the weight of responsibility. I learned to smile again, not the bitter smile of defiance, but the genuine smile of someone who had nothing left to hide. And slowly, I realized that my story was no longer about them. It was about me. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself I had given away and stitching them into something whole. When people asked about my family, I told the truth. They betrayed me. I fought back. I survived. The words were not heavy anymore. They were armor, and they were freedom. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and painted my apartment in gold, I stood by the window and whispered to myself, for years I thought family meant duty. Now I know it means respect. Without it, there is no family, only chains. And I broke mine.